Hey, it's Rob. So today I've got something pretty cool for you. And if you've always found mixing a little bit of a mystery, if you found yourself going through the mix, not quite sure what you're doing, maybe putting some plugins and things on, but not exactly sure why or what the purpose of them are, well, I want to share with you a framework today, call it the 5 drivers of mixing. And I really hope that it's going to bring, clarity and just guide you through your mixes and make your mixing a lot more effective and just sounding a lot better in the end. When you have clarity and understanding, it really just frees up your mind because you're not thinking the whole time, am I doing the right thing or, what am I missing out or something like that. You can really focus all your attention on the main purpose, which is really making the song sound as great as possible, isn't it? So we're going to start out kind of old school classroom style. I've got this giant whiteboard behind me here and I'm going to draw out the concepts for you, and then we're going to head to an actual session where I show you these 5 drivers practically so you can see how they work. I'm going to mix a song from start to finish and show you how they work practically. Alright, so if you haven't done so yet, download the PDF that you see just below this video over there, and that's going to really give you an overview of everything that we're going to talk about here, going to give you some of the key points that you can refer right back to, and even if you don't have a chance to go through this whole video now, you can just scan through that and get the gist of all these concepts right away. Right, so with that said, let's get started. And I guess the first question that we've really got to ask here, before we do anything, we've got to answer the question, what is mixing anyway? And there's so many aspects and kind of nuances to mixing that I think it's impossible to put it into one little bite-sized like saying or something like that. But if we had to look at the essence of it or what the textbook definition would be, it's essentially taking a multi-track session and turning it into a stereo wave. So if I just draw out our little session here on the board here, and let's say these are our tracks over here. This is very sophisticated artwork over here. Well, say this is the vocal over here, and we've got a guitar, and what else do we have? Bass. Okay, so just 3 tracks over here. Well, Joe Soap, who's listening on his iPod, he obviously doesn't have multi-track software playing, and it just wouldn't be very practical, would it? If everyone had to, load up a Pro Tools or Logic session every time they wanted to listen to one of their favorite CDs, right? So the answer is that we've got to get these down into a single track over here. And actually it's a stereo track, right? So still the industry standard at the moment is still CD kind of quality, which is 44.1 16-bit stereo. So that's still what we're trying to get it to most of the time, right? So we've got to take all our tracks. It doesn't matter if it's 3 tracks or if it's 100 tracks. We've got to get it all down to 2 tracks, which is a stereo track. Okay, so it's really how we do that, and it's how we go about that makes all the difference, right? So depending on how we do that, it's going to affect the sound. So although that might be the definition, there's so many ways to get there, and we want to get there with the best sound possible by making the song, really sound the best that it can possibly be. Okay, so I'm sure that's fairly obvious to you already. So the real question is really, how do we get these tracks over here to sound as good as possible in this final mix over here? That's really what you're trying to do, isn't it? Well, the answer is obviously we use certain tools. So we use plugins and pieces of gear, and obviously we need to know how to use those tools. So that's really half of what mixing is, right? Is knowing how to use the tools to get a certain result, which is this end product over here, right? Okay, so that brings us then to the next question, which is, how do you really decide what tools to use anyway? And when you really boil it down and you think about it, mixing is really just asking a series of questions, right? So you're asking some kind of question like, well, what should I put on that vocal over there? And you might say, well, an EQ, and then you put the EQ on there. So that's how you're deciding it, and that might be from different things you've learned, like you saw some guy putting an EQ on once, or someone told you need to put on an EQ. Could be from all kinds of different places that you learned that. But the bottom line is, the other half of mixing is really just asking the right questions, because the right questions are going to lead to the right tools, and with the right techniques are going to lead to the result that we're looking for in the end. And this brings us to one of the biggest challenges that so many guys face when learning to mix, because you can essentially have all the tools, right? You can have all the fancy gear, and you can even know how to use it. You can watch tutorials and things like that. But if you don't know why you're using it, if you don't know the purpose, then you're never really going to get the sound you're after, because you're really just guessing, aren't you? You're just putting things on for the sake of it. So it really all starts with asking the right questions, because every decision we make starts out with a question. And if you doubt that, well, in order to have doubted that, you must have asked yourself, do I doubt that? And you would have said, yes, yes, I do doubt that. You see, what makes it so tricky is that these aren't conscious questions that we're asking ourselves out loud most of the time. They're all happening in our subconscious. So we unconsciously asking these questions. And so it's really the quality of the questions that we ask that make all the difference. And most guys are just not asking very good questions. And, I can remember when I was starting out, I was learning this stuff. I can remember, the kinds of things that I would ask myself, subconsciously. I'd do this mix and I'd just be, oh man, it's just not sounding good. And I'd be asking myself, why does my mix suck? And you can just imagine, what kind of answer can you possibly get to that? Well, because you're an idiot, that's why. Because you have no idea what you're doing. So it's not a very clever question to ask, because what can you possibly get out of that? So probably one step up from that might be, what can I do to this track to make it sound better? Right? So it's a little bit of a better question. It's still not very specific, but at least that gets you somewhere. So then I might go, well, I could probably put an EQ on this vocal because I saw some guy do that once and it made it sound better, so let me try that out. And so that's kind of the way that most people figure out how to mix. You sort of just go from terrible questions to asking something that makes some kind of sense, like, well, how can I make my track sound better? And then you throw in some kind of a plugin and then you tweak that a little bit until you think it sounds better, and you go, okay, well, that seems to work. So this isn't very effective because it's really only looking at the mix from one perspective. So I want to show you now the 5 drivers of mixing. And these 5 drivers, they're almost like categories of questions, because when you break it down, there really are only 5 core reasons why we do anything in a mix. So these 5 drivers will help you determine the right questions to ask, and by asking the right questions, that'll hopefully lead to the right tools and techniques and getting you a better result at the end of the day. All right, so let's take a look at these 5 drivers then. And I'll just start up by writing that out on the board here. This board's a bit of a wobbly there. And by drivers, what I mean are these are the factors that really drive the mix and get the end result, right? So these are the core essential components of every mix, really. So not only that, but these really form the basis of every decision that you make, and that's the questions that you ask, right? So the first one, number 1, is balance. And balance is really, the essence of mixing. And in fact, mix engineers were actually originally called balance engineers. Why? Because their job was simply to balance these tracks over here. So they would take that vocal, that guitar, and that bass, and they would balance them. So that's really the core of mixing. So what are some of the questions that we can ask in a balance? Well, you could ask things like, what is too loud? What is too soft? What can't I hear in a mix? What is the focal point? So whatever the focal point of the mix, that's obviously going to be, a little bit louder than everything else, because balance doesn't mean to make everything the same level. I think some guys get a little bit confused about that, and that just leads to the most boring mix in the world, right? Where everything's the same, and that just doesn't make any sense. That doesn't bring out the real energy and the motion of the song. What is the main focal point if we had to look at this? Probably the vocal. In most songs, the vocal is one of the main focal points, and then there's something else, maybe some kind of a beat or a groove or a bass line or a riff or something like that that is also one of the focal points of the track. And then some of the other things, like maybe a pad or something, maybe that just goes more in the background. So balance is simply setting the best balance for whatever song you're working on. And that's going to differ from track to track. So it's really about setting the levels to bring out the best in any given track that you're working on. So how do we set the balance? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? We're just going to use the fader and we turn that up or down. But there's also a bunch of other places that we need to check it. For example, every time you put on a different plugin, that's going to affect the balance. And that often has inputs and outputs.
We've got different sends. Maybe the vocal is being sent to a reverb, and we've got to check the levels of that so it's not clipping and it's not too soft or whatever. So we're checking the balances of all these different aspects over here and making sure that it's right and making sure that it works for the mix. And once we've set the basic balance, we can then move on to more complex things like automating the balance to work, in different sections of the song. So the balance really forms the core of every mix. And so we have to keep on asking ourselves these various questions to make sure that the balance is right. Okay, so let's look at the next driver now. Now, driver number 2 is fix. So the second thing that we have to do is we have to fix anything that's wrong in the mix. Anything that's distracting or taking away from the song has to go. And I've always said, and I've always noticed that there's one way that you can always tell a really great mix or a great production, and that's that there's nothing wrong with it. When you listen to it, you can't pick out anything that's wrong with it. Whereas if you listen to an amateur production, there's always something that gives it away, right? I'm sure you've experienced this before as well. You listen to something and you go, oh, it maybe sounds quite cool, and then the drums come in, you go, whoa, what happened to that snare over there? Or it just sounds really weird, or the vocal has some strange effect on it or something, like a weird sounding reverb. It sounds like they were singing in their master bathroom or something like that. There's always something that gives it away. So if you have nothing that gives it away, then people just assume that it's a professional production, right? So we have to take away anything that could possibly give it away. And I could tell you I've spent more hours than I could ever count fixing up different mixes that I've gotten, from bad recordings and all kinds of things. And, the worse the recording is and the worse the musicians are, typically the more fixing you're going to have to do. So what kind of questions do we need to ask? We need to ask things like, does something sound harsh in this mix? Is there something that's sounding, really piercing to my ears? Is there something that's out of tune? Maybe like the vocals, and we have to fix that. We have to tune the vocals. Is it in time? Are there some frequencies that just don't sound right? Maybe there's a strange resonance, or if there's some noise or something like that. So all these different things, we've got to make sure that whatever tracks we're putting into this mix over here, there's no problems with them. Because any kind of problem, say the bass guitar has some hum on it or something, like where it's got this low frequency hum, maybe there was something wrong with the amp or something, that's going to get blended together with everything else, and it's going to ruin the pot, so to speak. It's kind of like putting in ingredients in your cooking or something that is off or something. If you put some sour milk in, you taste the food and you don't quite know what it is, but you just go, this just doesn't taste quite right. Well, in the same way, if we put anything into the mix that isn't quite right, there's something wrong about it, often you don't hear it in the final mix. Often when you listen to it, you just go, something doesn't sound quite right. And then when you really dig in there, you see, oh, okay, there's these little things, like maybe this hum there is causing a really bad, dissonance in the track or something like that, but you don't actually consciously pick it up. And what does the average person say? I don't like that song, right? They don't know what it is. They don't know it's the sound. They just go, I don't like that song. So it's so critical that we fix up anything that could be taking away from the song in any way. So what tools can we use? Well, there's a whole bunch of different tools you can use, from EQs to fix different things with the frequency spectrum. If the vocalist maybe has too much S's, that sibilance, like a tst, well, we could use a de-esser. That's another thing that you have to fix in the mix if that's a problem. We can use compressors to fix certain things. There's just a whole range of things, different noise reduction plugins if there's a problem with noise. So it's just then a matter of choosing the right tool. And we don't have time to go into all of those right now, but this just gives you an idea of some of the things that we have to fix in the mix. All right, so let's move on to number 3. And the third one, let me grab a new color here, is to enhance. And this is really where, this is probably what you're most familiar with, right? Where we go through the mix and we just add a bunch of things that just makes the different tracks sound better. Enhancement is anything that makes the mix sound better. It really can be anything, and this is really subjective to a certain degree. So what are some of the questions that we can ask? Well, things like, how can I make a track brighter, or warmer, or fuller, or bigger, or any of a number of things that might make it sound better? And the kind of tools we can use for that are pretty much everything, right? So we can use EQs, we can use compressors, we can use reverbs, delays, really anything, different effects. Maybe if you're going for interesting effect on some track, you could use a vocoder or something like that. Anything that you think enhances the sound of the track. So it's really widespread, this one, and it really covers just about everything. But this is really the thing that the kind of modern day mix engineer kind of brought to the table. Back in the day, mix engineers, like I said, they were more balance engineers, and they would just kind of balance the levels and sort of set them basically like that. And generally, they would just do what the artist told them or what the producer told them. Whereas now, a lot of mixing engineers, they actually are used for the specific sound that they get. So the way that they mix is like a part of the production. So they bring certain enhancements to the sound, and they actually take, a recording and they make it sound a lot better, and they kind of add their kind of signature to it. So this is another like core part of every mix really, and we've got to go through all the tracks, and we just want to make them sound as good as they can possibly be. So once we've done that, we can move on to the fourth driver, which is, grab another color, to shape. Okay, so what do I mean by shape? Well, when we're enhancing everything and we're kind of making it sound as good as possible, we're often listening in solo and we're making it sound really good. But when it comes to the mix, it doesn't matter how good something sounds in solo, right? It doesn't matter how good that vocal sounds or that guitar sounds. All that matters is how it sounds over here, because that's all the end listener is going to listen to, right? That's all that matters. So that's really the most important part. So when it comes to shape, it's really about listening in context and shaping the instruments to fit together. You could think of it as blending together, or you could think of it as two shapes in a puzzle, how they kind of, those puzzle pieces fit together. Well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build that as this final mix, basically. Let me give you a little bit of an example here. If you, let's just say over here, if we had to analyze use a spectrum analyzer to analyze two tracks, right? So the one of them, let's say that we had that guitar over here, and that guitar was kind of had a frequency range, something like that. Okay, I'm just guessing here, whatever. And then let's say that the bass guitar, let me use a different color here, went something like that, and then probably went down like that, or something like that. Okay, so the red's the bass guitar. Now, at the moment, you can see how these two overlap over here. Now, this isn't a huge problem when we've only got two tracks, right? When it's just a guitar and a bass. But times this by 50 tracks now, you've got a little bit of a problem. What starts to happen is it starts to get really muddy, because what's happening is all of these things are layering over each other. Does the muddy mix sound familiar to you? Well, what's the answer to this? Well, one way to go about it is that we can take an EQ and let's say, for example, we put an EQ on the acoustic guitar, and we can put a high pass filter so that it cuts this part out over here. And then it leaves it open here basically for the bass to feature. So one of the ways that we can go about shaping is that we can shape different elements to fit better in the mix in certain ways. We could then take the guitar and put an EQ on and add some tops over here so that it would make it go more like that, right? And I'm kind of exaggerating the curves here just for this example over here. But then it would have kind of more top end energy over here. And where does the vocal sit? Well, the vocal is a mid-range mainly. So it's mainly sitting in this area over here, right? And so by doing that, we're kind of shaping the guitar around the vocal as well. Otherwise, in order to hear the guitar, you're bringing up this whole section here, which is then getting in the way of the vocal. Another way that you could do it, if the guitar is getting in the way of the vocal, is to cut some of the mid-range over here. Say around that 1K region over there. That can help make the vocal more audible, can make it more clear in the mix. So there's so many different ways, and this is another key part of mixing, and this is a really essential part. And generally cuts tend to work better for shaping, because they tend to take out frequencies instead of just adding more and getting more clutter in there. So when you cut these frequencies out, it just makes more space in the mix. So shaping is often one of the most neglected areas of mixing, and yet it's possibly one of the most important, because it really affects the way that the end mix sounds and how all these different instruments and elements work together. And some of the questions you might want to ask yourself when it comes to shaping is, does it sound like something is clashing with something else? Does it sound like something is in the way? Even things like, is there something that I'm not hearing? Instead of choosing to just turn up a level, you might choose to rather shape certain instruments to fit together better so that you can hear it better, right? So perhaps, for example, if it sounds like the vocal isn't very clear, like I just showed you over there now, just turning up the vocal in the mix, what's that going to do? Well, it's just going to put it on top of the mix. Maybe the answer is instead to rather cut out some of the things that are getting in the way of the vocal, which will then make the mix more open and it'll make it more clear. Right, and that brings us to the final factor, number 5, which is space. And that probably sounds a bit ambiguous when you first hear it, but this just means what is the space, whether it's the ambience, whether it's left to right, no matter what dimension that the instrument or instruments are sitting in. So for example, we draw a little, practice my 3D skills over here. Right, so that's supposed to be a 3D box over there. And in any mix, right, if we had to listen to this mix over here, you've essentially got 2 dimensions, right? You've got left and right over here, put left and right. And then you've got front to back, if I just draw those in over there, something like that, right? So how do we control those? Well, left to right is obviously pan, right? So if you change the pan part, I'll change that, and we can create a sense of depth by using things like reverb or delay, right? So that's kind of the cool thing that stereo brought to the table, to the mix, so to speak, no pun intended, when it came along. So before stereo, they only had mono. So mono is just one speaker. It's very difficult to get a sense of depth with one speaker. You just can't really, because that's not the way our ears work. The way our ears localize sound is from 2 sound sources at least. So we've got 2 ears. And so by having 2 sound sources, by having stereo, which is just 2 sides, like we showed over here, we're ending up with a stereo mix, so left and right. We can then create this sense of depth and dimension. And that's really what we're doing in the space. So some of the questions to ask could be, what kind of space do I want this instrument to sound in? Say it's a vocal, for example. Do I want it to sound, larger than life, or do I want it to sound like it's really intimate and up close? So this ambience that we're creating, the sense of space over here, really just adds that extra something to a mix that sets the amateur mixes apart from the really professional ones. You always listen to the professional ones, and you'll hear how everything seems to have its space. Most of the time, it's not always the case. Sometimes some mix engineers like to mix dry, others more wet, but generally they still have the individual spaces. And there's a couple of ways you can go about this. You can go for a natural sound stage, so to speak, where you imagine the instruments on the stage. Some people like to mix like this, where you hear the guitar slightly to the left, and then maybe the drum kit slightly to the right. So if you imagine the stage and how the instruments are laid out, then they like to mix like that. Others like to mix totally differently, where it's just more creative, where it's like the guitar is way out to the left, it's hard left, the other guitar is way out to the right. There's a synth coming from the background somewhere. So there's really no rules when it comes to this. It's very subjective. It's just a matter of trying different things out and doing something that works for the mix and for the style, because obviously, the style is going to determine that, to a large extent. If you're doing, for example, something like a heavy rock track, it tends to benefit more from more, larger than life, settings. So using pans that are right out to the left and right, and using maybe a dry sounding vocal but maybe some big delays or something like that can work. Whereas if you're doing something like a softer acoustic number, then more natural pannings and more natural depth and space tends to work better. And sometimes giving all the instruments the same sense of space can work. So sending them all to a similar reverb to make them all sound like they're in the same room, for example, that can actually work quite well. So that's what we're doing in the space. We're just creating a sense of depth and dimension. And that's really covers the 5 drivers. So what you may be thinking now though is, okay, are those the 5 steps? Are those the 5 steps that I got to do to mix? I have to balance, fix, enhance, such and such. And the answer is no, these aren't steps. Okay, so, a year ago when I brought up my mastering stuff, ever since then I've been asked by so many people to bring out a mixing formula or a system or something like that. And, I tried for months to come up with a set of steps, something that you could follow, and it just wasn't working. And literally it took me, I don't know, like 4 or 5 months to figure this out. And because I just was trying everything and I couldn't figure it out. And eventually I got to the point where I realized it's actually impossible to come up with a set of steps for mixing. And the reason is because mixing is really an iterative process. Okay, so it's an iterative process. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's not one thing that you do and then you're done with it and then you move on. Like, this, right? It's really a series of doing sets of things and coming back around certain iterations. So you're going through the process of transforming something, of making adaptations and tweaks in the mix until you're getting closer and closer to this end result that you're after. And each kind of time you go around, you might think of that as an iteration, right? So we're basically just going through these 5 drivers again and again in these iterations until we get closer and closer to that end result that we're going for. So does that mean that they're in a random order? Well, actually not. They actually are in a specific order for a reason, which I'll be able to explain better in the prac session, that's going to be coming up after this one. But just to give you a basic idea, it makes sense, when I start a mix, I start by balancing, then I'll go about and fix everything that needs to be fixed, and then I'll go and enhance certain things, and then, maybe shape certain things. It's difficult to really shape elements of the mix if you've still got things to fix and you haven't enhanced them yet, because when you add plugins to enhance something, it's going to change how they sound, and then it doesn't really make sense to shape them at that point, right? And I prefer to rather start shaping the elements before I just start adding a bunch of reverb and space and things like that. That's just my preference. So this is a basic order, and it is sort of like step-based up until that point. But after that, it's really, whatever needs to be done, and you can really just use anyone. And as you're going along, you pretty much just jump to whatever you need. So for example, you'll probably jump back to balance all the time. So you might balance the things basically, and then you might fix something, and then you might enhance a couple of tracks. And as soon as you start enhancing them, the balance obviously changes. So you're automatically going to balance the mix again. A lot of the things are just happening automatically, and you don't have to worry about that. This is ready to use as a guide, as a framework to check, have I covered all my bases? Am I, maybe if you get stuck in the mix and you're just not sure what to do next, this will just help you by, asking some of these questions again. And as you go through the questions, you'll be able to determine, what needs to be done next in your mix. So you now know the 5 drivers that really form the core of every single decision that you're going to make in a mix. So do you see now why it's so important to know why we're doing something before we just put some random plugin on a track and tweak it, right? So for example, you could put an EQ on that vocal, for example, and it could be to fix it. You might want to fix something in that vocal. You might want to use that to enhance it in some way. You could also use it to shape it, perhaps to fit better in the mix. And believe it or not, you could even use it to create your sense of space, because actually taking off some top end, rolling off a bit of top end, actually creates the perception of something being a little bit further back in the mix. And so that's affecting the sense of space that you got going on over here. So it could be for any of those 4 reasons there. And so understanding the reason that you are putting on something beforehand, and understanding and asking yourself the question, well, what needs to happen to this vocal, and going through the different factors here. Does it need to be balanced? Does it need to be fixed in some way? Is there a tuning problem? Use these different questions. Can I enhance it in some way? Can I add some top end? Can I do these different things? Does it need to be shaped in some way? Although the vocal is usually the center of the song, so generally we might shape other things around it. And then finally, how can we kind of give it a 3-dimensional sound and perception by creating a sense of space around it? So you can use and you can go through all these drivers, and you can use them on each instrument as you go through them in the mix to really just guide you and give you a sense of purpose and direction in your mix, so that you become much more intentional with the different processes and tools and things that you're doing in your mix. Because ultimately, covering all these bases will just help you to get a much better sound at the end of the day. All right, so it's been quite a long and intense session this, and I'm sure you've got all kinds of things, spinning around your head as you think about this now. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it over here so that it'll just give you a chance for the stuff to sink in, for you to process it, and then I'll catch up with you in the next video with the actual session where I'll take you through the actual mix and show you how I apply these 5 drivers in a practical sense. So tell me, did this help you? Has this kind of changed your perspective a little bit on mixing? Has it perhaps brought a little bit more clarity? I'd really like to know. So if you've got something to say, if it did help you, leave me a comment down below, and I'd really like to hear back from you. If you have any questions, you can also just leave them down below, and I'll definitely go through all of them, and I'll try and answer as many as possible, I promise. So I'll catch you down in the comment section. Otherwise, I'll let you know as soon as I've got that next video for you. I'll talk to you soon.